Well, good morning. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us here today. My name is Diane Wiles, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the CEO of Leadership Waterloo Region. And my colleague, Bethan Llewellyn, and I are just so pleased to have you here. I know we have friends that are here today from all over Canada, and we have some friends from the UK. And I thought I would just share a little bit of Canadian wisdom with you to start off. It is almost May and it is snowing here today, which means I looked out the window and saw my neighbor walking their dog in a winter coat, a toque, shorts, and sandals. Now, this may not seem like a usual attire, but in Canada, believe me, we're so desperate for summer to come. People are out there in their sandals and shorts as soon as they can get there. So as we go through, I'm just going to talk about a little bit of housekeeping. We ask that through this session, you keep your audio on mute unless you're asked to take it off of mute, or Bethan will unmute you if you have a question, as Cormac asks. Choose your view. So in the top right-hand corner, you can choose speaker versus gallery. The gallery view is a lot of fun because we encourage you to keep your cameras on and you can see people that are participating. Please use the chat feature at the bottom of the screen for questions. I do have the questions that you submitted upon registration. And as Cormac goes through his presentation, I'll be sure to check off the ones that have already been answered. And then we will go through. Please send additional questions at any time and we'll make sure we get to them. Stick around to the very end because a lot of that comes out, a lot of the meat comes through the question and answer period. We are recording this session, so if you haven't been able to maybe get to a hairdresser and you want your camera off, I'll leave that up to you, but it will be going out on our public media or social media as well as Cormac's. We also asked two things. One is, if Cormac says something that's engaging, you agree with, it excites you, just give him a little wave of your fingers because as a presenter, it's great to know people are engaged. As well, you will be receiving a follow-up email with a recording of the session, a copy of the slides, a list of resources that you can use and share with others, and an evaluation. It's really important to us responding to this COVID crisis that we're providing programming that our communities need. So please take the time to fill in that evaluation. I'll just turn you over now to Bethan.
Thanks, Diane. I have the pleasure of chatting with you this morning about something that we adopted at the beginning of this, what I'd like to call the COVID situation, and that is a set of virtual convening principles. So we are an organization that relies pretty heavily on in-person engagement and interaction. So it was important for us to be able to adapt these virtual convening principles so that we were able to move forward in a way that really aligned with our values. So first up, nobody signed up for this. So no one signed up for sickness, for social distancing, not for the additional stresses that this type of a situation brings upon us. And no one asked for having to now facilitate everything virtually or for participating at home and dealing with the stresses and the interruptions that children and pets and other life brings upon us. And not for mastering new technologies as well. As we know, that can often cause the stressors that outweigh a lot of the day-to-day things. We promise that we will remain human-centered. So we're going to prioritize supporting each other as whole human beings. And we're going to prioritize sharing resources and communicating clearly whenever and as often as we can. We can and will continue our mission virtually. So shared experiences are no longer possible in person, but we promise to continue to create emotionally engaging virtual spaces. And our objectives will be met in an ever-shifting world, and we will adapt our delivery to meet the needs. And finally, we will remain flexible and adjust to the situation. So nobody knows how long this is going to be going on, or for where this is going and how this is going to change how we move work going forward. So everybody needs to support and understand each other in this unprecedented time. And in times of crisis like these, we have chosen to lean on our strengths-based leadership of trust, compassion, stability, and hope. Now, these aren't all of the details. I've just given you a high-level overview. So if there's anyone in the group today that would like a copy of these, I'd be happy to share them out with you. Feel free to just reach out to me privately in the chat, and I'll copy your information down, and I'll get those out to you sometime today. So I'm going to turn it back over to Diane now, who will introduce our facilitator for today. So take it over, Diane.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bethan. Okay, let me just start by saying I'm absolutely honored and thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce to you Cormac Russell. I actually woke up this morning and rewatched a TED Talk, which got me very excited about today. Cormac is the Managing Director of Nurture Development and a faculty member of the Acid-Based Community Development, ABCD, Institute at Northwestern University, Chicago. Over the last 20 years, Cormac has worked in over 30 countries across the world. He has trained communities, NGOs, and governments in ABCD and other strengths-based approaches in Kenya, Rwanda, Southern Sudan, South Africa, the UK, Ireland, Sweden, the Netherlands, Canada, and Australia. He is passionate about the proliferation of community-driven change and citizen-centered democracy, and has supported hundreds of communities to make ABCD visible through what he calls ABCD neighborhood learning. His motto, paraphrasing Benjamin Franklin, is, "When it comes to community building, well done is better than well said." In January 2011, Cormac was appointed to the Expert Reference Group on Community Organizing and Community First by Nick Hurd, MP, Minister for Civil Society in the UK, which he served on for the term of the group. Cormac is also the author of many papers, which you will receive some links to some of his readings, and the brilliant book, Abundant Community. I'm not going to take any more of your time up, so I'd just like to turn it over to Cormac. Thank you.
Oh, I should unmute myself, shouldn't I? Can you all hear me? Good to be with you all. It's funny seeing that photograph and seeing my pre-COVID haircut and my COVID style contrasting there. It's great to be with you, and I'd say it's probably appropriate to say good morning and good afternoon, because I believe we have folks from the Netherlands and from the UK with us. Do we have people from any other country? I know we have the Netherlands, we have Scotland, we have England, Northern Ireland, I think. Anywhere else? Just let us know in the chat if you do hail from any other part of the world, and we'll acknowledge you as well. So it's great to have you with us. And what I thought I would do to begin with is to just extemporize a little bit, just set the scene in terms of my thinking at the moment around asset-based community development and what it can say to how we're responding to some of the challenges and some of the possibilities that COVID-19 are enabling and maybe closing down as well. But also I want to hold a very clear eye towards renewal. So what I want to suggest really is that the adults in the room, of which we are very much not buying the idea that we're engaged in a war. We are not engaged in a war. This is not an apocalypse. You know, we really need to steady things down and manage the rhetoric and be very careful about the language we're using. Social distancing is not helpful. We should be talking about physical distancing. Language frightens people. We can only understand our world through the words we have. So social isolation is also scary. Cocooning, the long Sabbath, staying at home. These are all terminologies that I think people relate to, but we must continue to find ways to remain social. So for sure, we need preparedness. For sure, we need to figure out how to respond. For sure, communities are going to take on functions that maybe have traditionally been taken on by institutions. Many of you, for example, if you have school-going children, are teaching your own. And I'm sure with that comes joy and at times consternation, if you're anything like our household. But it's also really interesting. Many of the functions that have been outsourced to the professional world are coming back to us. And so, some of that we're welcoming in very generously. And some of what we're also having to do is to welcome the unwelcome. We're having to welcome functions that we wouldn't wish to take on. About 13 days ago, I buried my mother. I watched her being buried on FaceTime. It's not something I would welcome. It's not something I would want anybody else to have to welcome. But we're having to take on functions and we're having to do things that are profoundly stretching and heart-scalding. And that is the reality of a crisis. Also within that, we must keep an eye to the idea that we're not at war, but we're planning a resurgence. That's what we're at. And resurgence is combination between, at one level, responding to the challenges that are before us, while also moving towards a renewal. Not in any kind of woolly, sentimental kind of way, but with swagger and with a real sense of bodaciousness, and a real sense that we will prevail and still we rise. And that's the principle of, I think, community building. What we're seeing throughout the world is a revelation. It's interesting that the word apocalypse, in its original meaning, actually connotes the idea that something is being revealed that could not otherwise be revealed, except for the circumstances of the situation in which we find ourselves. So yes, in that sense, we are living through an apocalypse. But things are not getting worse. They're simply getting clearer. I don't think we could ever be clearer about who real leaders are and who are not the leaders in the room. I don't think we could be any clearer about the policies that have not served the people who are at the margins and those that have. I don't think we could ever be any clearer about who really is, worthy of a proper wage and what kind of reforms need to come. I don't think anybody is arguing anymore about the need for universal income. And I don't think anybody wants to live in a world where people have to make a choice between their livelihoods and their lives. And so I hope that after all of this, as well as being connected with our neighbours and organising at street level, we're prepared to bang some tables and demand for some change as well. Today I've been asked to speak about a lens, if you like, through which we can think about the world we're in and the world that we plan to renew and move towards. Now that lens is called asset-based community development. So I'm going to move on to share some thoughts with you. Just in terms of preparing ourselves, I wanted to invite you to consider these 4 questions for about 2 minutes or so. So in a moment, I'm going to go quiet, but I want to just frame this up a little. So this is your own personal time. When I go quiet, you'll have 2 minutes to consider these questions. And the way I'd like you to consider each of the questions is to ask yourself on a scale between 1 and 7, how am I showing up in this conversation? 1 being the least and 7 being, pretty intense, pretty high. So we'll take the first question just as an illustration. So to what degree do you intend to get value out of this workshop? 1 might be, I'm here passively to receive information. And I think, you'll be moving upward to 5 and maybe 7 if you understand that really the value comes as much from what you put in as what you take out. So I'm going to go quiet. I'm going to ask you, using the scale between 1 and 7, to consider each of these 4 questions. The last piece of information I want to give you here is I'm not going to ask anybody to tell me what number they gave themselves. So that's not what this is about. This is for your own personal reflection in terms of animating you and enabling you to show up in this conversation. So maybe a little under 2 minutes, but certainly a bit of quiet time. Reflect on these questions, please, and see where you're at. Okay, a little under 2 minutes, but hopefully it's enough time. What I'd like to do is to invite maybe 3 people to share with me something that struck them about one or all of those questions or a number of them. If you're open to sharing with me, what I'd like you to do is to indicate in the open chat box that you're keen to contribute. And Beth Ann will then facilitate you. She'll moderate that part of the conversation and indicate to me who is willing to share. And then I'll call you each by name individually. And we'll just hear from about 3 people. Thank you. So I think we have 5 offers.
So Cormac, we have Alison Miles,
Okay.
Andrew Owen.
Okay, let's start with Alison.
Okay.
So Alison, the question is, what's struck you about those questions? I'm asking what struck you because I want to bring lightning into our conversation.
I think for me, it's just made it really kind of personal, and that this is not about coming to listen to some guru who knows everything, or to be a kind of passive passenger in the room. That I'm here today because I want to find out what the rest of the world is thinking about some of the issues that I'm trying to grapple with just now.
That's great, Alison.
I want it to be as fruitful as possible, because now that it's getting recorded, I can kind of pass it on to other people.
That's great. Yeah, beautiful. Well put. Thank you. Beth Ann, who else is?
Andrew Owen. So I will unmute Andrew now.
Andrew. Okay, so building on what we've just heard Alison share with us, Andrew, anything you'd like to add about what struck you?
Sure. What struck me out of those questions in particular was the indication of risk that exists, and just how much courage it takes to enter. I heard you describe community development once as discovery instead of delivery, and to move from not just our status quo and move into something different that we don't know, and how COVID has impacted us and put us all in an environment where we absolutely have to face discovery because we don't know what to do or how to do it, and we're struggling under that to continue to do the things we did, and we're succeeding. So it's about how that little piece of courage in the face of all of that fear and craziness led us to discover greater courage for ourselves. I'm sorry, I'm speaking in general terms. I'm not really speaking about myself. So
that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. That's wonderful. Well put. So we make the path by walking it. Yeah. One other, Bethan, before we...
Nancy Mattis, so I'll unmute Nancy. Just one quick second. There we go.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Nancy.
I'm coming
Welcome.
Thank you so much. So I just wanted to, as I reflected on the questions that you presented to us, it struck me that you are really trying to gather the wisdom from the room as opposed to just sort of lecturing at us, and that's a way for us to be engaged, but also to learn together.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, those three contributions for me really sum up exactly what asset-based community development is all about, and very much trying to begin this sharing and this conversation in the spirit of saying that it's the collective wisdom of the group that matters, but it's very hard to open that wisdom up if somebody comes in who has a certain degree of privilege or a certain degree of perceived authority and they don't use that well. So in many respects, from a leadership point of view, and this is a leadership series in responding to COVID, I think one of the really critical things to attend to is authority, whatever authority might be, never gets relocated by accident. I've never been in a situation where I've walked into a room, or I've been in a community, or I've been, in working at ministerial level, and somebody says, well, I had authority, but I don't know where it's gone. It's just disappeared. So authority, power doesn't get relocated accidentally. It gets relocated intentionally. And I think this is really, really important, because what we're seeing, and I think it is a revelation, what we're seeing being revealed is a lot of stuff that was previously invisible. And it was rendered invisible because of the way we organize society. So we're beginning to see be made visible the gifts of local people, the value of contributions, the importance of relationships, the value of being in a home place, as we engage in the long Sabbath. Talk about physical distancing and not being allowed to touch each other. We're allowed to touch the people whose lives we're committed to, if we're lucky to be in reciprocal relationships, but many people aren't. So the value of welcoming the stranger in, the neighbor in, and the idea that it's a good idea to make friends with your neighbors before you need them. And the clock is ticking because we haven't hit the crest of this thing yet. So these are all principles right there, I think, in those questions. And it feels to me that one of the things before we problem solve around whatever the core issue we might be, or whatever we think the answer is, whether it's universal basic income or it's, the right of people to ensure that their voices are heard at the most local level, whatever the right view that we have, I think we have to build community before we problem solve. And part of that is relocating authority so that everybody feels they can show up in the conversation. So I thank you for taking time to reflect on those questions. The other thing, just before we move on, is language. There's a world, at least one world, in a word. And when you look at the words intend, prepared, responsibility, and I mean responsibility in the sense of the ability to respond, not responsibility in the sense of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. What I think those words are saying is exactly what Alison was reminding us of, which is that this isn't about a passive receiver and an active producer, but this is very much about citizenship. We're in an active citizenship. This backyard revolution that we're all engaged in at the moment is a radical act of citizenship. And it seems to me that at the very least, we might talk about that as a challenge. So I want to think about the few minutes that we have together around the lens of ABCD and in terms of what the world is like right now in the context of COVID-19. And what I want to suggest really is that the challenge isn't necessarily about the pandemic at all. That in many respects, the pandemic is a precipitant. It is precipitating or triggering a whole set of things, some of which are very, very bad, and some of which are quite, as I said already, revealing. So it's triggering us to take on a whole set of functions, which I would argue were functions that we previously used to take on, and then we outsourced to the institutional world. So one of the things that's coming back to my community is death. I heard somebody recently, I think maybe 6 months ago, say, I don't do older people or death, or 19-year-old, the kind of lippy 19-year-old, I'm sure, didn't really mean any harm by what they said, but it really kind of jarred with me. But I think often functions like dying, functions like teaching, functions, like health, often people pre-COVID have thought of those as, my health is in the hands of a doctor, my education or my child's education is in the hands of a teacher, and so on and so forth. And one of the great transformations that's happening is many of those functions now are coming back to us. We may not welcome all of them. We may be very resistant to them, but some of this is about welcoming the unwelcome and learning that we actually do have core functions within community life. And when we outsource them, there may be some risks attached to that. So I just want to talk a little bit about this. Now, I guess what I want to talk about in this framing is what I see as the challenge. And I'm going to do that sharing two stories. One's a metaphor, the other is a story. The first is a very well-known nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty, which I think near everybody on the call will be familiar with. And for those who aren't, the health warning here, or the spoiler, is it ends badly, right? So the nursery rhyme, just to remind you again, because it may be a while since you've heard it, goes, Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Now, in a sense, it's really interesting. If you think about some of the language we're using around COVID, we talk about the vulnerable. We talk about the needy. We talk about the hungry. We talk about the shielded. And in many respects, there's truth in what we're talking about, but there's also a lot of hidden dangers in those labels. It's like Humpty Dumpty's on the edge of the wall, and all we can really see is his or her vulnerability. We don't see his gifts. We don't see inside of Humpty Dumpty. And very quickly, we can move into rescue mode, where Humpty is the sum of his needs, and we are the king's horses and the king's men. Now, one of the interesting things about that nursery rhyme is that a wall has two sides. So on one side of the wall are all the king's horses and all the king's men, the institutional world. And they have a certain set of things they can do, but they're also very limited. So, for example, they're not able to put him back together again. What I want to call your attention to in this presentation is the other side of the wall. And I would like to suggest to you on the other side of the wall is the non-institutional, non-contractual world, which loosely we could imagine to be community. And actually, I think we have to imagine our way into community as well as act our way into community, because you can't truly commit to a community until you've been disenchanted by a community. You see, commitment to community isn't committing to some kind of an enchanted romantic idea. It's committing to a set of relationships, warts and all, with the good stuff and the not so nice stuff. Somebody said to me recently, God, this stuff, this mutual aid stuff's driving me crazy. We got all these people coming in trying to be rescuers and heroes and taking over. And a massive generalization, but I kind of understood the trend that he was referring to, because actually in a crisis, and we've worked at a lot of crisis scenarios in Ebola, in Western Africa, and pre and post genocide in Rwanda and so forth. And there's nearly always trends. So one of the trends is things get quite hyper initially in reaction to a crisis, and you can see quite a lot of hero-based kind of behaviors rushing to the fore. No bad intent, it just kind of tends to happen. And then in the second latter wave, there tends to be a period of disillusionment. But in that very early period, he was describing how a lot of people in his community were taking over. And rather than attending to the community building, they were attending to the problem solving and looking for people to fix and rescue. What I want to suggest to you is when we go over to the other side of the Humpty Dumpty wall and we start thinking not about people as intrinsically fragile or vulnerable or susceptible or needy, but we think about people as, you know, yes, there are people who are very vulnerable to COVID and more vulnerable than others, for sure. But that isn't the whole story. That's part of the story. The other part of the story is they have a whole range of gifts, knowledge, skills, talents, and passions to share. And why should we give them an either-or option? You know, how do we actually relate to the whole person? And instead of rendering them as the one that has the sum of their needs and us the one to be the hero with our cape on, that we actually recognize all of us are vulnerable. All of us are fragile. In fact, we are as fragile as our most fragile neighbor. Our health, and this is the great reminder, we are all interdependent. Our health is totally contingent on the sickest person in the neighborhood. That's what this revelation has done. It's woken us up to the fact that, as a Canadian First Nations elder would teach us, all our relations, that's the greeting, right? All our relations, we are all interdependent, and you can't be independent without interdependence. So the Humpty Dumpty phenomenon is an important one to pay attention to. And what we're beginning to see is that as we see a resurgence on the other side of the wall, the community side of the wall, we recognize we need both parts. We need both expressions in our lives. We need strong communities, but we also quite clearly need institutions in reserve, supplementing what the community cannot do. It's not either or, but it's not that both are doing the same thing or they're interchangeable either. There are different functions at play. And just to maybe illustrate this a little bit, if we think about isolations, a lot of people talking about isolation, and a lot of people who haven't traditionally experienced isolation, experiencing it maybe for the first time, which is edifying, I suppose. And it's not something I would wish on anybody because it can also be quite upsetting and challenging for our mental health and our well-being generally. But there are many people who, as a norm, experience social isolation. And it's nothing to do with them intrinsically. It's the way we've organized our society that has caused that to happen. So particularly true of people with labels. And you'll see here a slide that illustrates about 20 years ago, the results of 51 people who had the label of disability in Canada and the US who were interviewed. And they were asked, who's in your life? Who are the people in your life? And, you know, numerically, the numbers of people were counted up, and you can see how it sort of divided out there. And what's clear in the diagram here, I think, is just how few people were in the lives of those 51 people that you would call friends and neighbors. How few people, relatively speaking, when you compare them to the number of people who either had the same diagnostic label as they did, or who were paid to be in their lives. And this is a really, really important consideration, certainly from an asset-based community development perspective, say the measure of how we respond to COVID and how we actually engage in renewal is not the strength just of leaders in our organizations and our groups, but also the depth of our associational life and the ability that we have to welcome in the stranger, the labeled person, the person that we farmed out and we've said, well, we've organized society so that people like you go to the professional places, to the congregated settings, to the places where other people like you can be and where specialists can deal with you, because we don't have a clue how to deal with your difference. And what's interesting, I think, is that community, which is a verb, not a noun, so you do community, you don't point at it. Community and the doing of community life is about figuring out how we deepen our associations and welcome the stranger, not because we feel sorry for them, not because we're sympathetic, but because empathetically we get something that's at the heart of what it means to do and be human together. And that is that they have a gift and we can't be a community without them. We can't be well without them. So it seems to me that if you were trying to imagine a yardstick by which you could say, we're ready for the next pandemic or the next heat wave or the next whatever crisis may come, we're ready for it. Because we have figured out that life is not a sprint, it's a marathon, but you've got to run it to the rules of a relay race, where the person who has been pushed most to the margin is the first person over the line, where the person who has been defined as the problem secures the power to redefine the problem. And that's the resurgence that I think we're trying to imagine ourselves into, if you like. So for me, that's not about providing programs or providing services or even providing money necessarily, but it's about figuring out how we move the conversation beyond the service and the program to a good life. Yeah, because what people want is a life, not a service. They want someone to love, somewhere to live, something meaningful to do. Don't we all, right? But how do we make sure those that are most marginalized are at the heart of that? And I think that's about moving, this idea that our good life is in the classroom, it's in the doctor's surgery, it's in the hospital, it's in the hospice at end of life, to all of those institutional offers have their place. There's nothing wrong with them. But it's actually an inversion of democracy to think that the king's horses and king's men are going to put us back together again. What brings us back together again is relationship. It's near neighbors. It's not salaried strangers. And so there's kind of a sense of needing to imagine our way into what that might look like. What a kind of a radical idea, like, for example, thinking that the neighborhood is the primary unit of change, that the parish or the bounded block or the street is our primary unit of change, not the individual and their pathology or their problem, their vulnerability, although we care about that deeply. But that's not the primary unit of change. It's not the individual in isolation, nor is it the institution and what the institution can do. But it's the place itself, because the place is where everything can potentially come together. It's where neighbors can come together. It's where neighbors can come together with economy at a scale that allows us to keep money cycling in the economy. It's where we can connect with ecology, local food production, the care of our children. We can age across a life course there. We can also get institutions out of siloed thinking and into a much more dynamic way of working. So even in a city, I think of cities as archipelagos of neighborhoods or federations of neighborhoods, like in Seattle, where they've really begun to imagine what it would be like if they organized their local governments and their institutions the way people organize their lives, instead of expecting people to organize their lives the way the institutions are organized. It's hard to imagine this, isn't it? That you could create the context within which collectively people have learned how to join together and be powerful in the act of doing so. It's really hard to imagine that. So let's take an example of where it happened. So I want to tell you a very brief story. And Beth, and I'm going to rely on you slightly here as a moderator to keep me on track in terms of time. Because when I start telling stories, I lose track of time. I think it's a Celtic disposition. But this is a story I want to try and tell briefly, and I think it really helps us to imagine the latent power of community, which is often invisible. And a lot of what we're trying to do here is make the invisible visible. Now, I think that's exactly what COVID has done. It has made the invisible visible. So I want to tell you a story about a period of time, about 200 years, in the history of Martha's Vineyard. Martha's Vineyards in Massachusetts. For 200 years, it was home to an extended kinship group that came there from Kent in the UK. And in amidst this extended kinship group was a feature, a congenital feature, whereby many, a disproportionate number relative to the average population of the people in the kinship group were deaf. And so accordingly, when they landed and they actually made a life on the island of Martha's Vineyard, they all, both hearing and deaf people, used, or people who were deaf, excuse me, let me use people first language, used sign language, very particular sign language. So they were all bilingual in that sense. Now, what's interesting is, and this is captured by an anthropologist, Nora Grouse. She wrote a book called Everybody Here Speaks Sign Language. There's a picture of the front of the book. What she observed was that on the island for 200 years, everybody had the same quality of life outcomes. It was almost indistinguishable. So across the life course and across the different experiences, people who were deaf and people who were hearing were essentially marrying to the same extent, having the same number of children, being as engaged in political life, having the same number of businesses started, and so on and so on and so forth. So they had the same quality of life outcomes right across the board. She then did something really interesting. She looked across North America and tried to find the places in North America where people who were deaf had the best outcomes. And then she compared and contrasted. And she found, interestingly enough, that the mainland of Massachusetts at that time, that's where, you know, the best outcomes were. But statistically speaking, those outcomes were still way, way, way behind the outcomes of people on Martha's Vineyard. So what she was basically saying was, on the mainland, the best schools, the best institutional supports, the best resources were available in Massachusetts. But even still, even with the best institutional support, people were not having the quality of life and the quality of outcome that they were having in Martha's Vineyard. And what's the difference? Well, anybody who knows anything about inclusion knows that many of the labels we use are social constructs. You know, the issue is not the person. The issue is how we've constructed society, right? Now, what's happened that is different in Martha's Vineyard is they've figured out how to organize to radically include the gifts of everybody, right? So they've figured out how to ensure everybody can participate. Now, for them, if they talk during that period about somebody's vulnerability, they talk about somebody being vulnerable to not having their gifts seen, heard, or received. And what they're engaged in, or they were engaged in, is removing the barriers, right? Removing the barriers to participation. And that is something that's very hard for the king's horses and king's men to do in isolation. That's community work. That's community business. So how do we do that across all sorts of areas where people are at the margins, whether it's homelessness, rough sleeping, you know, whatever the challenge we may bring to this conversation? How do we do that? One of the people that I've grown to love over the years is this lady, Judith Snow, who died in 2015, but her memory very much stays with me. Judith was one of the first people in Canada to receive income instead of service. So she received $120,000 a year to support her to participate actively in life. She needed it because 6 months after her birth, she lost the movement of most all of her body, except her ability to speak and to move this thumb. And so she needed a huge amount of practical support to be able to participate. She used the money not just to employ personal assistants, but also to employ people who, as well as being able to assist her personally, could also support her to contribute her gifts in her community. She saw herself as an artist, which she was a very gifted artist. She also saw herself very much as a community builder. John McKnight, who some of you will know reputationally as the founder of ABCD and one of the founding framers, asked her 3 years after she received her basic income, if you like, how much of the money did she use to buy services that before she received that income or that support, she had offered to her or foisted upon her. And she said hardly any, actually. In fact, mostly what she did was she spent the money on, obviously she needed an adaptive wheelchair, so she bought that. But mostly she spent the money on things that she herself saw as a priority. And hardly any of the things that she previously was offered by the institutional world made any sense to her at all. It's an interesting question. I often wonder this when I'm working with people myself. If the people that I'm trying to help had my salary, would they use my salary to purchase the service that I'm telling them they need? And this is one of the problems with needs analysis. Nearly everything that we're doing around COVID at the moment is about doing some kind of an analysis of need, some gap analysis or whatever it might be. But how can we possibly know what people's needs are until they first know what their resources and their assets are, and until they're able to contribute and they're able to participate? So it's a real difficulty, because I think if we're starting our engagement with communities just around the needs analysis, then we immediately are moving into confusing people's needs with our service categories. And we really run the risk of just providing people with what we think they need rather than what they actually do require. And that principle of people can't know what they need until they first know what they have is a really important principle to hold on to, because I think it shifts our narrative away from this idea that we're in the business of delivering things to people who passively receive them, like Alison pointed out earlier on in relation to the questions at the start, that's what the questions disrupted that idea and opened up space. And moving into, I think Owen, I'm not sure, said, you know, what we're actually about here is discovery, not delivery. And so Judith's great teaching, I think, is to say, you can't know what I need until you first take time to discover and help me discover what I have, and not just me personally, but what I have within my community, within my environment, with my neighbors. I'd like to stop now, and I'd like to just invite, maybe not, I just want to just see who has energy for this. Bethan, again, you might help us with this, but I want to hear what's alive for people right now. So again, maybe 3 or 4 different voices. So what's alive from you? I'm aware there's somebody joining us from the Netherlands. There's somebody from Scotland. You know, let's try and get a few diverse voices. But I want to start with some voices from Canada. So let's hear from 2 people, Bethan, from Canada. And my question to you is, what's alive for you as you reflect on what I've been sharing?
So first up, we have Keenan Weller. So let me just unmute Keenan 1 quick second here. Go ahead, Keenan.
Excellent. I hit that by accident, but I'm happy. Yeah, so one of the first things you were talking about, it just occurred to me, so our agency supports people with intellectual disabilities who have certainly received the vulnerable label in this crisis. And one of the things I've been gently trying to suggest in some of those conversations, the people we support are by and large handling this much better than the average population, and getting 0 credit for that. And all the dialogue is about their vulnerability, and none of it is about what they contribute or actually how they're helping other people through this crisis. A lot of them are helping me, frankly. They're greeting me in the morning in nice ways. They're thinking about me. Their families are thinking about me in surprising ways. And so I just wanted to introduce that. And also, it's very powerful what you said about the vulnerability and vulnerable to not being able to contribute or not being able to share gifts I love that core flip of the word vulnerability, because I tense up when I hear that, because it's not how we look at supporting people. They're not vulnerable people that we're bestowing with our gifts of normalcy. They're just people who are prevented from offering everything that they have to offer for various reasons built into society. So I like how almost in one sentence you provide a way that we can kind of flip that conversation, that yes, for sure, this person, due to the labels or their perceptions around them, are vulnerable to not being able to contribute in ways that is not a barrier for others. So I just wanted to share that, and I appreciate that very much.
That's great, Keenan. Thank you very much. Good to see you again, by the way.
We have two actually on deck. So we have Kim Sproul and Donna Marie Dunk. So Kim, we'll start with you, and you're unmuted, so go ahead.
Hey, Kim.
Hi, Cormac. I saw you a month and a half ago. It's good to see your face again.
Yeah, likewise.
Keenan, I really appreciated one of the things, Cormac, you said earlier, is we start to see who is and isn't the leader, what rhetoric or what policies are and aren't helpful. It's a beautiful moment to see folks who have been excluded from the role of leader take that on. I have watched as folks take on that, and so the next step will be to maintain that and continue to value it after it is no longer deemed like crucial or necessary. I think what we get to do is take this so-called, like you said, language, this so-called crisis, we get to take this opportunity and say, we can do this more because we just did it. So we're going to get the opportunity to show to others, when we said we couldn't, these things that couldn't happen are now happening. And in fact, I won't ever stand for it can't happen, because it did. And previous behavior predicts future behavior. So let's just ball rolling. So I very much appreciated both Keenan and yours comments about leadership. I think that's going to be crucial. And when the great meme that says, you know, when we're no longer socially distanced and back together, let's just make sure that we are, and not continue to allow that to speak for some of the population. When we have experienced this, it's no longer acceptable to take some out. We now know the devastating impact as we see it, and the need for community even more. Well, like, let's not, at all means all. So thank you so much, Cormac.
Thank you,
I really
Kim.
appreciate it.
That's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
And next up, we have Donna Marie. One quick second. And you're unmuted, Donna Marie. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Hey, Donna Marie. How are you?
Hey, Cormac, I'm good. We provide independent facilitation, is particularly focused in the development of networks of support, bridges to belonging. And so I'm doing lots of this because it's like so passionate for us. One of the things that, actually two things that is very conflicting for me is there are areas of involvement that I'm a part of where I see the system is scrambling to try and meet the demand and these issues that are out there, and the approach to just pushing resources and pushing information. And of course, people need resources. And at the same, but I watch the system just scurrying to try and achieve it. On the other hand, I'm speaking with people daily who, some of them have a community of support around them, a network of support around them, and their resources are all available. They're finding everything they need within their community. And of course, there's information and other things that we do to supplement that, but they're very empowered to do what they need to do to meet their own needs. And then there's those people that we're working with who don't have that community, and they're totally lost because they're being overwhelmed by all of the information and the push that the system is scrambling to try to do, and they can't reconcile all of that. So, I'm seeing the full extent of the continuum, and I feel too, we're very much at a crossroads right now for people to really acknowledge the value and the impact of a community-based, asset-based approach to being able to have people, use the empowerment they already have in their own lives. I don't need to empower them. They are empowered. I just need to get out of their way.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks, Donna Marie. Yeah, really powerful.
And There is one young lady from the UK, Stephanie Mooney. Let me just unmute her. Wonderful. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Hi, well, firstly, thank you for letting
Hi,
me
Stephanie.
have a Cormac. I'm really interested because I feel, in some sense, trying to live a double life. So on the one hand, so I support working very closely with partners in Africa, predominantly Sierra Leone, but also in the UK context. And it's been interesting in terms of this major pressure to get volunteers to help the vulnerable. And I'm working actually for a local based organization who's trying to provide support for other organizations. So what's been amazing to see is so many people wanting to come forward to give their time. But what's interesting is that we've predefined their roles. We can tell them, you can collect shopping for somebody, you can get their prescription, you can have a chit and chat conversation, which is only at one level. And I think the conversation today is really making me feel, in terms of, we need to reshape the dialogue. And what's interesting is that within the UK context, I don't know if it's the same, certainly in the Canadian context, the sense of the system and the institution feeling a constraint that you can't really relate to the community in the way that you wish to. Whereas in the Sierra Leone context, I'm seeing assets for people who actually feel like they've got so many less resources, and I really struggle to resolve both those side of things. So I feel really challenged and alive to say, okay, well, how can I now try reshaping that dialogue? Because there's so much potential, and the fact that people want to do and be part of something, there's for me a live opportunity for me. And I love the comment about the vulnerability, how we use labels and how that changes that sense of how we see people. As soon as we see someone as vulnerable, as soon as we put a label on them, we stop seeing them for who they really are and what they are, and only just checking in. And if we miss that, I think we're also missing an opportunity to reshape to the community or the society that we really want it to be. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, that's powerful. Just incidentally, on that, go back to the metaphor again of our friends on the Humpty Dumpty side of the wall, the imperial side of the wall. If the king's horses and king's men say, we've got a crisis, we want all of the people on the community side to volunteer to help. Now, what we want you to do is we want you to climb over to our side of the wall, get on helplines, and we want you to randomly, anonymously call people. We're going to police check you, obviously. So you got to look like us and be approved by us. And, so for example, with the NHS in the UK, 750,000 people put up their hand and volunteered, right? At least 3/4 of them, as I understand it, are still unclear about what role they're being asked to take. You go to Sierra Leone, and I saw it in 2014 through to 16 around Ebola, and you see the localized response, the organizing, and it's, to me, it's the difference between taking a scarcity mindset and peddling programs to the community and saying, well, these people are the sum of their pathologies and their problems, but don't worry because we've got the solutions and we're going to parachute them top down. And the abundance mindset, that we actually believe that communities have a huge amount to offer. Not everything, there are limits to local, of course, and that's why we have institutions. But we are on tap, not on top. And I think the difficulty is we have an inversion of democracy going on. And it's nobody's fault, this actually. But what has happened, I think, is that people have come to believe that their health is in the hands of the doctor, or the hospital, that their education is in the hands of the teacher, and so on, that our political, civic life is in the hands of the politician and so forth. And what actually is beginning to happen here is we're kind of reversing that to an extent, and we're saying, no, in a democracy, the role of the professional is defined as that which happens after the important work of the citizen is done, not the other way around. And actually, if we want resilient communities that are able to live well and be vibrant, but also respond to challenges, because there are challenges in life. That's part of the, you know, the deal. For example, life is a terminal condition. We're all going to die, you know. Not everybody has gotten that memo, but it's going to happen, right? That's part of who and what we are. We're bounded creatures. And within that, we have to learn to do suffering. We have to learn to die. We have to learn to find joy in all of that too. And these are some of the things that I think are resurfacing. So one of the things, for example, I would commend if anybody in the NHS is listening to do is to triage all 750,000 people and say, before you come on a helpline, can you make sure your street is organized? And hey, we'll even figure out how to provide, not empowerment, because you're empowered already, but provide support and remove barriers to you doing that. And one of them is, we'll start by trusting you. Now, this isn't to pick on the NHS, because I actually think they're doing amazing work, but also trusting our frontline staff. I would commend, you know, the big institutions in Canada and Netherlands and the UK and so forth would employ anthropologists who can actually sit at the feet of communities and sit at the feet of frontline staff and learn from them what they're doing now. Because I think the workarounds and the creativity and the abundance that is emerging every day in our hospitals, in our communities, is just astounding. And my fear is we'll lose those stories. We'll lose that learning. You know, the other thing we can do is go and sit at the feet of people in Sierra Leone and other places and say, teach us what you learned. We can go to people who've been isolated in our neighborhoods for years and we can say, can you teach us how to do this way of living? Because you know, we don't. So, you know, these comments, they liven me up a lot and give me a lot of hope. So thank you very much. Beth Ann, did you want to include anybody else at this point? Anybody else kind of burning to get in?
No, but there is a question that's come forward, and I hope you'll forgive me for jumping ahead of the Q&A, but I think it's really pertinent for the conversation we're having right now. And it comes from Alice Miles. Why have we got to the point where people think they have to have permission from someone else to get involved?
Well, let's put that question back to Alison for now. Let's just check in. Why do you think, or what's your best guess?
I think, without generalising too much, I think some people are frightened that they'll be seen to be interfering or too nosy, or that they've got ulterior motives before they can get involved. So where I stay, there's at least, over the whole county, there's about 1,000 people volunteering. Now, I don't know how many of them are doing something in the community before this, and they've moved, but almost immediately the problem was about people thinking that were they genuine, that brings out the best of people, but almost brings out the worst of people. We're trading standards in the police, alerting people to scams. And there was a bit of people chapping on people's doors saying, I'll collect your shopping for you and I'll charge you £15 for it, because they heard people were coming out. So there's always going to be this kind of danger around. So I think for some people, it's just, even probably in their own street, it's about not wanting to be seen to be interfering in other people's lives, rather than seeing that as being received as a help.
Yeah. And have you found anything that practically responds to that or gets over that?
I think what there's an organisation in Angus that helps support organisations, but it's a strange kind of thing they've done just now. They've kind of taken on the whole kind of volunteering army development, because that's what it's been called, themselves. So there's a kind of conversation we need to kind of have afterwards about that. But they've actually kind of developed a My Street approach, which I quite like. So people have been asked to kind of help out in their own streets with people they've maybe not even spoken to before. So the hope is that afterwards they'll still ask those questions, are you okay? So in a way what we've done is actually had to professionalise it a wee bit of people being given permission to kind of speak to their neighbours. and just how enriching that is for people. But my worry is, does this army go back to base camp once COVID's over?
Great. Thank you, Alison. Bethan, can you just do a time check? I've lost complete track of where we're at. So what are we?
So we're at,
what are we looking at?
We're at about 5 minutes before we have to wrap up.
Okay.
What I have seen in other online sessions is that if there are additional questions, if folks are willing to stick around for another 15 minutes after the session ends to ask those questions, Cormac, is that something you'd be open to?
Yes. So we're looking at finishing at what time, Bethan?
Quarter after.
Quarter after. Yeah. Yeah, that should be fine. I have another call, but yeah, I can send them a DM. It'll be fine. Because I want to try to go with this. If this is where the energy is, it's always best to be responsive to the energy. So just taking what Alison is saying, and hopefully it'll resonate for other people as well. Often that's what happens when there's coherence comes into conversations. People can kind of channel some of the thinking. I can really empathize with that sense of needing some kind of an on-ramp, something that says it's okay for me to show up in my neighbor's life, having not shown up before. And so it can be really, really helpful to find that there's a community builder in the neighborhood who connects me to my neighbor, because I might be unsure about how to do that. So for sure, there's all kinds of ways, I think, where professionals, the king's horses and the king's men, can actually climb over the wall into the community space, into the civic space, and be appropriate about the way that they behave when they're there. Now, in the same way, I wouldn't go into a neighbor's bedroom and start rummaging around in their cupboards. You know, when I come in as a professional into citizen space, I want to be really, really respectful about how I do that. You know, so I'm not going in to recruit clients to come back over the wall into my institutional world. So this is really important, I think, in terms of languaging. I think we nearly need to find new language here to describe this, right? So I think what the professional is doing, or should be doing, maybe could be doing is better than should, could be doing, is instead of classically providing a service or recruiting clients for a service, I think what they're trying to do when they're, being useful and being a good servant in this instance, is they're precipitating citizen-led action. And they're saying, so there's no scarcity of hospitality and goodwill here, but maybe people are struggling to know how to connect. So what we need to do here is find ways of precipitating or triggering those connections that aren't directive. So we're not saying, well, we think you should get together and do this. We're just saying, we get that it's hard to get together. We don't care what you do when you get together, as long as you don't harm each other. But we think that most people are good. And when most people get connected, their lives are better. So let's figure out ways of practically doing that. So I think that's a pivot, or that's a shift from the classic, I am a service provider for clients, to I am a precipitator of citizenship, which enables neighbor-to-neighbor connection. So those who were isolated are now interdependent at the center of natural communities, and that means I can pop back over the wall and stay in reserve until I'm called or needed. Mm-hmm. Now, the language, if you want to be technical about this, right? The language here in political philosophy is subsidiarity, that a bigger entity doesn't do for a smaller entity what it can do for itself, and doesn't do any harm to that ability. So the state should be, and big institutions, not-for-profits, should be saying, we're institutions. It's not our job to be a neighbor, So if we've got situations where we're seeing voluntary organizations and not-for-profits delivering food parcels to vulnerable people, and they're not actually trying to connect people with each other, then by all means, I think we need to have a difficult conversation. We need to say, well, hang on a second here. Are we getting our roles confused? So I think this is a really, really important question, because it's a question about how we serve while stepping back you know, and that servant leadership piece. Not to abandon, because, you know, organizations are in a tough spot here politically. You know, if they go in too quickly and they overreach, they're going to damage the social fabric and the social connections. And, you know, they'll overwhelm people and they'll undermine people very quickly because people have become professionalized, you know. So I think people are quite tentative. Am I qualified enough? Will I be accused of stealing somebody's purse? You know, there's all of these, you know, anxieties, I suppose is the word, right? Dilemmas. So I think a professional who's being sensitive in this space, in citizen space, is one who knows how to not be an insider or an outsider, but be an alongsider, to walk alongside communities. Now, of course, there are things that communities can't do. And this is kind of, maybe I should just go to the last slide and then open up to questions. I'll just flick through slides if I may, because I want to get to these 3 questions. So in my mind, and I'll say this and then maybe open up, Bethan, to any questions that people have. In my mind, a way of thinking about responding to COVID, because, you know, the dilemma here will be, people will say, this is a crisis. There's no time for doing community development or doing all this woolly relationship building stuff. Forget all of that. We have to do safe, efficient, and fast things. So the best way to deal with this is for public sector organizations to get not-for-profits to do all of the relief delivery stuff. And we have to get the most needy, and we have to make sure that they're looked after. So that's the model. It's called the relief model, okay? And the argument from the relief school of thought is, we do not have time to do the development. That's fine on a good day, but we're in the winter of our discontent here. So don't be trying to promote that stuff. What I would say to them is that short-termism leads to projects that fail, leads to disaffection, and often leads to future scenarios whereby people are less resilient and more unsure of whether they should step up or not. So inadvertently, you create all kinds of difficulties. Now, if you're an organization that says, of course we must do relief, of course we must do emergency response, I agree with you. But I don't think it's one or the other. I don't think it's do emergency response and create a preparedness plan or do good community building. I think it's both. I think it's both. And actually, I don't know how you can do one well without the other, quite frankly, given the context. I'd be very fearful of people who say, oh, it's only about community development, you know. We don't have to recognize there's a response. Well, I'm sorry, you do. A couple of weeks ago in Spain, older people were found dead and abandoned in their homes. There's a real crisis here. People are dying. We've got to be the adults in the room. But that's not the same as saying we paralyze ourselves and each other with fear. That's not the same as saying we're only going to do response and crisis management. It's about saying we have to do both. We have to do what we do in a way that actually opens up the road to renewal. We have to, for example, consider that in a few weeks' time in some countries, when it hits the crest, it may be that neighbors will have to take on death doula functions, where they will have to enable people, their neighbors, through maybe even through their windows, to die with dignity. These are not functions that people want to take on. But I think it's very dangerous not to actually consider this, you know. And my hope is that we'll have organizations like hospices who recognize that now is the time to come alongside communities as precipitators and support them to start thinking about this. We should be organizing on our streets. We should be finding out who are the retired nurses who are prepared to step into these roles and comfortable with them because they're there, or other people, and doing our asset inventory of who those people are. So there's that component. I don't want to minimize that, but I also want to hold on to the other piece, which says that the resurgence and the renewal is also a very central part of what we have to do. You know, we'll have street bingo, we'll sing to the man who's 90 years of age, we'll do all of the other things as well. It's not an either or. you know? And for me, these three questions enable us to do this in a really helpful way. The first question starts with, what is it that communities can do in response to COVID, but also beyond COVID? What is it that we are uniquely placed to do, neighbor to neighbor? And I think that has to be the first question, because we're actually our first responders in this situation. The front line isn't the hospital, it's the neighborhood, particularly when we hit the crest. The second question that follows on from that is what else can we do with a little bit of help? Now your friends, Alison, from the not-for-profits, the third sector, public sector can come in because they've got expertise, but they have earned their stripes. We trust them now because they've gone at the speed of trust, and they've recognized we have value, and they haven't lorded it over us. They haven't been the know-alls in the room. They've been the humble servants with expertise. And so we can say, you know, there's a whole set of things we don't know how to do, and we could really do with some extra help here. We got some people who can't pay the electricity bill, or we've got, you know, some issues we just can't resolve. And there's plenty we can resolve, but there will be some issues that can be appropriately resolved with some help. Let's bring the help in a way that's collaborative and respectful to all sides. And then finally, there will be some things that we want done for us. Maybe that's where universal basic income and other such things come in. But I think by going through the dialogue and the discovery process in that way, what we end up with is a scenario whereby the king's horses and king's men can do what they do best, the community can do what they do best, and where there's need to collaborate, we collaborate, not in a way that casts Humpty Dumpty as the sum of his vulnerability, but recognizes everybody is vulnerable, and some more so than others. But ultimately, everybody has gifts and contributions, and all does mean all. There's nobody that's surplus to demand in contributing and renewing community life. So that sort of brings me to the final thought, really, which is that we need to rewrite the nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty. And I propose an alternative version, which goes like this. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, but all of his neighbours were ready to catch. They built him a nest where he safely did hatch. Thank you.
Excellent.
So should we go to questions?
Yes, let's go to questions. Thank you so much, Cormac. And the chat has been just lighting up. Okay, I have a question here from Nancy Mattis. Nancy is asking, what strategies do you use to engage vulnerable populations in ABCD?
One of the first things I think to remember is that connection, with near neighbors is a really vitalizing part of all of our lives. And so one of the things that we would want to really pay a lot of attention to is, what does a good life look like for this person? And what gifts have they got to bring to that conversation? And who is prepared to receive those gifts? So a big part, I think, of what we can do as we're walking alongside people who are marginalized or people who are vulnerable to not having their gifts received, is to recognize that the great challenge in life is not so much that our needs haven't been met, but that our gifts haven't been seen or received. So the very first thing is to recognize that labels obscure those gifts. So if you want to do something practical, lift the label off. Help the person to see themselves as having contributions, and then find natural communities where people are prepared to receive those gifts in a real reciprocal way, not in a charity-based or in sympathy-based way, and walk alongside all of those players in their journey. The more rooted that can be in a living community where the person, people can walk and be with each other, the more likely it is that you'll then be able to step back and allow those relationships to flourish, grow, and find diversity, So I think that's the essence of it, is really believing that the person that you're walking alongside has a gift, and that the community cannot do without that gift. They just don't know it yet. And then finding spaces for those gifts to be received. You could spend a very happy life doing that. And you know, your measurement of success could be, has the person that I've walked alongside had an experience as a result of what I've done, whereby they can say of 3 of their neighbors, those neighbors are now my friends. So I don't know if that's a strategy, but it might certainly be a practice worth cultivating.
Sounds like a best practice. I have one more question here about how do we motivate members of the community to keep going during this difficult time?
Okay, it's a great question. 2 things to say. One is, I think it's really important. This is for us too, because of course we're members of our own community here. Is that we contribute within our threshold. So don't contribute out of a sense of burden or a sense of some kind of false or misplaced duty. You know, if what you can do is you can contribute to one neighbor and consistently check in on that person and have a real relationship with them, then stick with that. You know, so don't overpromise. I think that's really, really important. Stick with what is doable for you. This is a very taxing time for people, you know, so figure out what it is I can contribute that's life-giving for me and for another person or a few people, and do that consistently. Show up, your whole self, show up to that. But don't operate out of guilt and don't operate out of sympathy. It's really important. And pass that message on to other people. So whatever your commitment is, and remember to do it safely. We're more likely to be the spreaders of this, you know. So we do have to take that seriously and find ways of being inventive, you know, how we can remain together while remaining physically apart. So it's going to take a certain amount of creativity. And I wouldn't let the idea of just doing that online stand either. But also we need to find ways of making those connections on land. I think that's really important too. The other thing to say is that communities, one of the things we can fall foul of is this idea that people are apathetic or they burn out. And they do if they overpromise or they overstretch. But that's the beauty of a community. So the more people that we can organize at street level. This is where the idea of the neighborhood being the unit of change is really important, because you're disaggregating the leadership, you know. If you think about it for a moment, every neighborhood has associations. You have the choirs, you have the walking groups, you have the groups of people who walk dogs. We could say to each of them, can we ask you to organize yourselves so you make sure that every member of your association is checked in on? This is no big deal to them because they do it anyway. So, you know, there's the weight watching group that's prepared to organize to, you know, do a weight watching session online, but also to call and check in, you know, and they're the groups, you know, and maybe beginning to organize ourselves that way. So there's an element of being a little bit strategic or clever, tactical might be a way of thinking about it. The street is also a good scale at which to organize. Are we doing things like, for example, giving people the traffic light system so they can put up, you know, red, orange, green, green, pass by, I'm fine, red, I'm in trouble, orange, I need an errand run. So it's beginning to think about things like that, having street champions, you know, so you can begin to address issues that Alison raised earlier on about people's security concerns, because it doesn't take much really. If 7 people agree that during daylight hours they'll take a stroll along the main road or along the block, and if anybody needs help they can call on them. You know, there's different ways of really heightening the sense that we're in this together and that you're not alone, and there can be quite visual ways of doing that.
Thank you. We're running out of time, and I want to thank everybody for staying on the line. If you feel your question you submitted hasn't been answered, if you could reach out to me and I can coordinate that and we'll send it on to you, Cormac, if possible. But
yeah, absolutely.
When I'm looking at the questions that we have left, I think you've covered them. I've taken away a lot from today. what I've never thought of is, I strive to be that alongsider, and that is language I would like to keep on using and encourage others to use as well. And welcoming the unwelcome, which is our responsibility as citizens. And as you said, as you started, we're only as strong as the weakest citizen. So on behalf of everybody in the room today and everyone who will benefit from that in our communities that we will share this information with, thank you so much for your time. This has been a real gift that we can all take back and make a difference. And this isn't just COVID. This is something that needs to go into when we write procedures, when we actively teach, when we are out recruiting, however that looks. It's very important that we keep this in mind. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane. Can I just say, each week I'm writing a blog, which is entitled A Guide to Professionals Working in Citizen Space During COVID-19. So I would just welcome you to check out our website, and maybe we can share details with folks.
Excellent. Yes, we'll
on
include
that.
that in the follow-up. That would be fantastic. Thank
Great.
you. And I'd
It's a
just
pleasure.
like to let people know that we run 2 of these sessions a week, and we're really trying to hold sessions that are relevant for the nonprofit area. So our next session is this Friday with Kevin O'Reilly, and it's from mental illness to brain health. So, it's defining tools that you can use in your everyday life that will help organize your thoughts and get us through these challenging times. If you have any questions at all about anything you heard today or Leadership Waterloo Region, please reach out to Beth and I at any time. And again, thank you so much for attending.
Thank you. Go well, folks.
Stay well.